Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the launch of the 2019-2020 What's Next. Just a little brief introduction of what What's Next is about. About a year ago, a group of lay people from across the Archdiocese started gathering at the Aquinas Center to address the role of the laity, particularly in regard to the sex abuse crisis in the church. And if some of you were here last February, we had Father Jerry McGlone talk about the sex abuse crisis, fact, fiction, and future. And we followed that up with a panel in April. So we had a group of people from, at this point we have 21 different parishes who are represented from across the Archdiocese. Plus, we gathered the adult faith formation people from a number of parishes. And it was out of those meetings that was determined that we needed to do some education. If lay people are going to be more involved with the governance of the church, we need to know the background, the history, the theology, in order for us to take our role as baptized believers in the church. And so out of those discussions came this year's What's Next. And tonight we're going to just kind of lay the foundation, the theology of the laity in the church. The next time we meet will be in October. We're going to do two different kinds of events in October. So those of you who are members of churches that have a large Spanish-speaking population, Hofsman Espino is going to be here the second weekend in October to do 3 lectures in Spanish in 3 different parts of the Archdiocese. The following Tuesday, Carrie Robinson will be here to talk about church management and lay involvement in management in the church. In January, Tom Doyle is going to be talking about canon law, which is another one of those underlying things that helps us know how we are engaged in the church. And then in March, we're doing a Me Too, Church Too gathering with Natalia Imperatori Lee. So those are the 4 gatherings, 4 in English and 1 in Spanish that we're doing this year, and we hope you're able to come to any of those. There are what Alice calls banners out on the table there, which has the dates of at least the fall gatherings that we hope you can participate in. This evening's our launch. It's also our what we call major Catholic speaker. It's a prominent Catholic theologian who's coming to speak with us at the Aquinas Center about an important topic, both just basic theologically, but also to kick off our What's Next series for this year. So I'd like to introduce Rick Gilardi, who is, I'm going to read this from because I don't remember things very well. Dr. Richard Gilardi is the Joseph Professor of Catholic Systematic Theology at Boston College and the chair of the Boston College Theology Department. Dr. Gilardi previously taught at the University of Toledo from 2001 to 2011 as the Thomas and Margaret Murray and James J. Bacik Professor of Catholic Studies at the University of Toledo and at the University of St. Thomas Graduate School of Theology in Houston from 1991 to 2001. So I have to tell you, the first time I met Rick was at my mother house in Adrian, Michigan, while he was teaching in Toledo. So I've known Rick for a long time. In 2013 and 2014, Dr. Gilardi was president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. It's the largest professional association of Catholic theologians in the world. It has over 1,400 members. And he's received lots of awards, of course. His focus has been on Vatican II and the implications of Vatican II, particularly for the role of authority and laity in the church. So I'd like you to welcome Dr. Richard Gilardi from Boston College.
Thank you. Well, it is an honor to be here. This is, in fact, the first time I've ever been to Emory. So it's a real treat to be among you and to see a number of friends and even a former student and so on. So it's a great privilege to be here. I also want to applaud the planning committee for the choice of the topic for this year. Because my work is in ecclesiology, I do a lot of public speaking that addresses the current clerical sexual abuse crisis and other aspects of really a long-standing scandal that we've been having to deal with, a crisis we've been having to deal with in the church. And probably understandably, most of my own reflections has been on certain institutional reforms that I think need to take place in the church. Things having to do with clergy, priesthood, seminary formation, the role of the bishop, and those kinds of things. And, to be honest, I think the church has to address some of those. I think there's some important challenges that we have to face. But there's also a danger about that kind of focusing on the clergy, the bishop, the seminary, and that is that it doesn't focus on us and our role. And I'm not saying that we're all culpable in the same way, but it is our church. And if we're to move forward, our strategies for moving forward can't just stop at what father needs to be that's different, what the seminary needs to be that's different, It needs to be thinking about, how do I reimagine my own role in the church? And so I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to reflect a little bit about our role in the church. It's interesting, explicit, kind of formal theological reflection on the role of the laity is relatively recent in modern Catholicism. One of the most famous theologians to raise the question of the role of the laity in a really constructive way was a 19th century English theologian, a convert from Anglicanism, Cardinal John Henry Newman. And Cardinal Newman was an esteemed church historian, and in fact, he knew that if you looked at some of the great doctrinal controversies that the church had to deal with in early Christianity, more often than not, he said it was the laity that played a decisive role in keeping the authentic faith alive when some bishops, for example, were seduced by the attractions of Arianism, a very popular, very potent heresy in early Christianity. And Newman suggested, therefore, that when the bishops exercised their unique teaching role in the church, it would behoove them to consult the laity for their particular understanding, their appropriation of the faith. It's fair to say he wrote this in the middle of the 19th century. It was not very well received at all. In fact, there was a British priest theologian who worked in the Curie at the time. His name was Monsignor George Talbot, who ridiculed Newman, saying quite simply, to hunt, to shoot, and to entertain, that is the province of the laity. But to engage in ecclesiastical matters, they have absolutely no right at all. And Monsignor Talbot largely won the day, up until the Second Vatican Council, which Pope Paul VI referred to as Newman's Council, because it was a council that began to grapple in a quite deliberate way with how we think about the role of the laity. So I'm mostly going to draw on the council, but I'm going to draw on the council as read through the pontificate of Pope Francis. There's an interesting feature about Pope Francis. He is the first post-Vatican II Pope not to have been at Vatican II. All of his predecessors in the post-conciliar period were at the council in one form or another, as a priest or as a bishop. He wasn't even ordained until several years after the council concluded. And I believe that every one of the post-conciliar popes, Paul VI all the way up to Benedict XVI, in their own way have carried forward some aspect of Vatican II's teaching. But I also want to argue that Pope Francis has offered a qualitatively distinct rereading of Vatican II, which is to say, I think he's carried forward some important elements of the Council's teaching that, frankly, were neglected by some of his predecessors. And he's done so in a rather imaginative fashion. That is, he reads the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, particularly as regards the role of the laity. He reads the teaching of the Council through three priorities, each elucidated by three images. And so the three priorities are, first of all, the priority of mission, which I'm going to suggest is illuminated by the metaphor of the church as a field hospital. Second, the priority of listening, which is illuminated by the metaphor of an inverted pyramid. And third, the priority of encounter, which is illuminated by what he calls a shift from the sphere to the polyhedron. All right? And so I'm going to use those three priorities and the images that accompany them as a way of inviting us to reflect on our own obligations and responsibilities in the life of the church. All right? So I want to begin now with Pope Francis's emphasis on the priority of mission. This is, I think, one of the great themes of the Second Vatican Council. The decree on the missionary life of the church, Ad Gentes, says the church is missionary by its very nature. And yet, before the Second Vatican Council, the dominant Catholic theology of mission was in many ways a clerical affair. It was about creating new churches by sending missionary clergy and also missionary religious to foreign lands to build new young churches and to win over new converts to the faith. And yet the council invited us to think about mission in a much more fundamental way. It suggested that the church exists for the sake of mission, right? And that mission isn't just winning souls for Christ. Mission means that the church lives always for and in the world, right? In service of the transformation of the world in view of the coming reign of God. Now, as the council grappled with its understanding of the missionary thrust of the church, one of the important questions that it had to deal with was the role of the laity. Because as I pointed out to you, prior to Vatican II, there was not a very robust theology of the laity, though I will say in the first half of the 20th century, we were beginning to see a number of lay movements emerge under this umbrella category known as Catholic action. And there were some particular lay movements that were quite interesting there, but the theology of the laity presupposed in many of those movements was still that the laity are sort of the auxiliaries of the clergy. They're there to kind of help the clergy or to extend the mission of the clergy. And the council knew that theology of the laity, you know, the lay person is the one who prays, pays, and obeys, that theology, the council understood that theology simply couldn't hold up anymore. But, and this is interesting because this was often the case at Vatican II, the council bishops were often much clearer about what they didn't want to say than in what they did want to say. In other words, they knew it no longer sufficed to talk about the laity as the priest's helpers. They got that. But then when they tried to say, okay, so let's come up with a positive theology of the laity, they struggled a little bit. And by the way, I'm going to suggest the struggle is an intractable one. Indeed, in case you want to sneak out before the end, I can tell you at the end of this whole thing, I'm going to suggest to you the theology of the laity doesn't have a future. But hang in there. It's not quite as bad as you might think. All right? And the reason I think ultimately, though I'm going to talk about the laity, ultimately the theology of the laity doesn't have a future has to do with a very simple thought experiment that I would give you. I encourage you to come up with a definition of the word laity that doesn't use the word not. And I don't think you can. And that's a problem. And the council struggled with that. Because no matter how hard it worked to say something positive about the laity, at the end of the day, it still had to say, but they're not this. But they can't do that. Does that follow? All right. So one of the things that happens at the council is that there are two theologies of the laity that actually stand in tension. And I want to insist they're both positive. They both have something to contribute. But the reason I'm starting here with the council is that while both are positive, one tract got a lot of traction under Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict, somewhat to the neglect of the second trajectory. That second trajectory I'm going to propose has been picked up by Pope Francis. All right? So, first of all, the council wants to say something positive about the role of the laity. So one of the ways in which it does that is it talks about the secular vocation of the laity. What characterizes the laity is that they live in the world, that they're concerned with temporal matters, that they're about marriage and family and work and citizenship and all of those kinds of things. Those ordinary, those basic, those fundamental obligations. But what the council said that was different here is that it treated that as a demanding adult vocation. Right? In fact, there's one way in which if somebody were to ask me in one sentence, say what Vatican II is about. If I had to do it in one sentence, I would say this. Vatican II called us to become an adult church. Pure and simple. An adult church. That is, it called the laity to become adults, to take an initiative. And so in one of the most important articles in all of the council documents, Gaudium et Spes 43, the council says that it is for the laity to take the initiative in living the gospel in their daily lives, in bringing the gospel into the world, in engaging the pressing political, civic, and ethical questions of their time. And then it goes on to say, for spiritual guidance, let them turn to the clergy. But let them not expect that the clergy will have an answer to every question, even every grave question, for that is not their role. Right? Gaudium et Spes 43. This is remarkable. Your task as lay people is not to say, Father, tell me what I should do. Father, tell me who I should vote for. It is to draw insight from their spiritual and pastoral care, but then to exercise your own adult vocation to apply the gospel in a myriad of circumstances in which we live, with creativity, with maturity, with prudence. All right? And so there was a great deal about this theology of the laity that I think we need to commend. And Pope John Paul II made a great deal of this particular theology of the laity. There's much value in it. But one of the shortcomings of this particular theology is that while it emphasized the creative initiative of the lay people to live out our vocation in the world, and that's a good thing, it ends up reinscribing, if you will, a very hard distinction between laity and clergy. Because what you still end up with is the laity being the foot soldier sent out into the world while clergy stays back at headquarters. Does that follow? And so it reinscribes this very strong distinction between the world and the church. And it suggests that the church ultimately, at least the interior life of the church, that's the clerical preserve, and the laity's preserve is out there. That's their secular character. All right? I think there's a problem with that. And the council itself grappled with this because it also recognized there's a problem with that, because it understood that there's something more basic than being a lay person and being a cleric. Right? And that more basic thing is, and the term the council used for this was Christi Fidelis. That before we're lay, before we're cleric, we're members of the Christian faithful. All of us. And so one of the most important architectonic changes that took place in one of the four constitutions of the council, Lumen Gentium, was a shift where a chapter that dealt with the whole people of God, which in an early draft followed the chapter on the hierarchy, was moved in front of the chapter on the hierarchy. And the reason for that was to say, for too long in the church, we have started with the question of clergy here, with the imagination of clergy here, laity here. Right? Pope Pius X spoke of the church in Via Mentor Nos as a societas inequalis, an unequal society made up of two different ranks. The pastors, who have sole responsibility for leading the church, and the flock, whose sole responsibility is to docilely follow the lead of their pastors. That was dominant Catholic ecclesiology all the way up to the eve of Vatican II. We're an unequal society. But Vatican II, by taking the chapter on the whole people of God and putting it in front of the hierarchy, said, no. Obviously, we will have some people in the church who are ordained and others who are not. Some people are called to consecrated religious life and others who are not. Some people are married and others who are not. Right? The question isn't whether there are different distinctions in the life of the church, but do we start with the distinctions? And they quoted a wonderful passage from a sermon of St. Augustine of Hippo, Sermon 340, in which Augustine reflects with his people on how he thinks about his role as a bishop. And Augustine says, whenever I am frightened by who I am for you, then I'm consoled by who I am with you. For you, I'm a bishop, but with you, I'm a Christian. The first is fraught with danger. I might think I was better than you. But in the second lies my salvation. Right? It's a wonderful juxtaposition where Augustine understands that before he's a cleric, he's a baptized follower of Jesus. And so the second trajectory that the council developed is one that didn't focus on the clergy's role here and the laity's role out there, but instead focused not on clergy and laity at all, but on baptism, and indeed on the baptismal priesthood of the whole Christian faithful. It started with the idea that all of us, the biblical notion that we find in 1 Peter, that we find in Romans 12, this emphasis that all of us are called to a priestly ministry, to make our lives a living sacrifice to God by virtue of baptism. And even the Catechism of the Catholic Church says the ordained priesthood, which we Catholics believe is necessary, I want to be very clear about that, the ordained or the ministerial priesthood exists, the Catechism says, solely to serve the flourishing of the baptismal priesthood. And yet so often it's felt like it was the other way around. Who's serving whom, right? But the council, still recognizing the need for a ministerial priesthood, wanted to put front and center the fact that all of us have a priestly ministry by virtue of our baptism. Right? We are all to live out of this radical gift that has come to us in Christ. Right? That has changed everything. To live our baptismal priesthood is to recognize that in Christ everything has been changed, even when things appear to be the same. One of the most provocative and insightful, if somewhat idiosyncratic theologians writing today is James Allison. And in his book, with a title I just love, Undergoing God, dispatches from the scene of a break-in. He offers a thought experiment to get us to reimagine what it means to not think of ourselves as clergy or laity, but called to a baptismal priesthood. He says, this is what we're thinking about. He says, imagine that you're an Albanian living in 1989, and you've just heard over the airwaves that the Berlin Wall has fallen. The evil power, which is the communist regime, has been defeated. Now, he says, undeniably, the communists are still in power in Albania. But it doesn't matter, because you know, and they know you know, that it is all over. And so you begin to celebrate because you know that the days of the beast are numbered. Now, that does not mean that the state police and party apparatchiks will cease to act as oppressive thugs. On the outside, everything in Albania may seem as if nothing has changed, when in fact everything has changed. And you know now that it is only a matter of time before the effects of the fall of Berlin Wall reach the streets of Albania. And so you begin to celebrate now. And perhaps by celebrating now, your celebration will even hasten the spread of this decisive defeat in your own land. So it is, Allison says, with the Christian life. Something decisive, we Christians believe, something decisive happened to the world in the Christ event. And by our baptism, we are to live out of that liberating reality of that something which happened in Christ. And by our baptism, everything seems different. Did this go out? I got a red light here. That's not a good sign usually. All right. The best laid plans. I'll trade you. So what's the point that Allison's making? The point that Allison's making is that we live in a world much like that Albanian in 1989, in which on the outside everything looks the same. And yet for Christians, we believe it's all changed. And we live out of the reality that Christ has in fact triumphed over hatred, bigotry, violence, and even death, even if that reality is not yet apparent in the world. And we must live out of that in order to make that more of a reality. And so the second theme that was so much a part of the council was an emphasis on the priority of all of us as baptized followers of Jesus living our discipleship in the world. All of us. In other words, what the council came to realize is that the whole church is sent into the world. It's interesting, the council uses the metaphor of leaven to transform the world. It uses leaven 6 times. 5 times early in the council, it's the laity who are called to be a leaven. But the last time that metaphor is used, in Gaudium et Spes, it's the whole church that's called to be a leaven. So the argument here is that all of us are sent into the world. Now that does not mean that the clergy or consecrated religious or monks engage the world the same way. But what it does mean is no Christian can afford to turn their back on the questions of the world. The pressing questions of our time are pressing questions for all of us, even if we address those questions in different ways. All right. Pope Francis, I believe, has taken this second stream and developed it in a very distinctive way in his pontificate. One of the things that I would point out to you is how seldom Francis makes a distinction between clergy and laity. He doesn't focus on that a lot. He speaks of missionary discipleship. Now, let me be clear. Obviously, Francis recognizes we're not all ordained priests or bishops or deacons, but his focus is not on clergy's role here, laity's role here, but on how all of us are called to be missionary disciples, right? All of us are sent into the world. And it's at that point that we get this wonderful provocative metaphor of the church as a field hospital. The church is a field hospital. Now, I have to say, the metaphor of the church as a field hospital has a certain generational inflection to it, right? So when I talk to my undergraduate students about this, I don't think it carries the same resonance as it does for me because they did not grow up watching MASH, right? But if you grew up watching MASH, this is a very evocative metaphor, right? It's a powerful metaphor. And it captures something that for Francis is tremendously important, which is to say you go out and you meet people where they are. You don't have a litmus test. You don't have them fill out a questionnaire before you decide to attend to their needs. You start by attending to their needs. In one of his very first interviews, he said, "It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugars. You have to heal his wounds, right? You have to heal his wounds." There are 2 features of this metaphor that Francis has emphasized over and over again, and they're worth our exploring as we think about our obligations. The first is that to speak of the church as a field hospital is to speak of the church as inherently vulnerable. Vulnerable. There's a provisionality about field hospitals. right, that the MASH television show captured all the time, right? These doctors were constantly working in less than ideal circumstances, right, without the kind of medicine and technology that they needed, and yet they didn't have the luxury, and it never even occurred to them to turn people away because they didn't have the ideal medical environment, right? We're going to work with the resources we have, and we're going to meet the people that come to us. And that's vulnerable, and that's messy, and we're going to fail, and we're going to make mistakes because of that, but there's simply no other alternative. And Francis is big on that we can't wait till we've worked it all out to go out and be present to those who are marginalized, to those who are in need, to those who are alone and bereft, right? There's something deeply Christological about this, and yet somehow our church has too often missed it, right? One of the most important features of the incarnation, after all, is the very vulnerability of it. The fact that the Word becomes flesh in a limited, vulnerable human person, right? Who was weak and ultimately suffered loneliness, perhaps depression, suffering, and even death, right? And yet, as a church, we have often resisted the idea that it is our lot to minister to the world out of our own sense of inadequacy and limits and wounds and impoverishment. And Francis wants to encourage us to get over that, to stop counting the resources and start going out and reaching out to people where they are. And so he writes, I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. I do not want a church concerned with being at the center and which then ends by being caught up in a web of obsessions and procedures. And so there's an invitation to all of us to not wait till our church has figured everything out before we go out and do what God wants us to do. But the second aspect of the field hospital imagery that I think is so important is not just the emphasis on vulnerability, but also the emphasis on solidarity. There's a number of wonderful episodes from MASH where one of the controversies was the doctors felt compelled to treat North Korean soldiers who were injured, the enemy, right? Out of a sense of solidarity with the fundamental goodness of every person, right? And to attend to their dignity and their right to be cared for, regardless of the circumstances. In Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis uses the term solidarity 19 different times, right? To be a field hospital is to say our first obligation is to meet people where they are because we see our fundamental connectedness with them. And in this politically fraught time, and I don't want to go too far down this road, this is a particular challenge for us, where we get so caught up in people's national or ethnic or racial or sexual identities that we lose sight of the basic solidarity that being a field hospital calls us to, which is that apart from our politics, what we start with is the fundamental decency of human persons where we encounter them. And that we meet their needs there, and there first, right? So Pope Francis says when he's speaking of solidarity, well, I don't have I thought I had the quotation up there. The next thing I'll say about field hospital before I go on is that there's another kind of aspect of the church's field hospital that I don't think we've explored as much as we should. At the Second Vatican Council, one of the interesting things that the council did was when it talked about marriage and family, it recovered a theme that was present in early Christianity but somehow fell to the wayside. And that is the idea that every family, every Christian household is called to be a domestic church. And that's very important. It's a theme, by the way, that was picked up very much by Pope John Paul II, right? But I want to I want to look at how the council treats this, because I fear, frankly, that the language of domestic church has been, if you'll pardon the pun, domesticated, tamed a little bit. There's a tendency, I think, sometimes to say the family is a domestic church is to say it should look just like the parish. Our parish has all sorts of religious artwork, and so our home should have statuary and pictures of the Blessed Mother and so on. At church, we engage in religious rituals, so at home we should be praying the rosary and grace before meals and so on. Now, let me be clear. I think those things are very good and very important that we do those in the home. I'm not convinced that's what makes our household a domestic church. All right? The council has a far more bracing understanding of what it means for the family, for the Christian household, to be a domestic church. It writes, "The family received from God the mission to be the primary living cell of society. When it offers generous hospitality and promotes justice and other good works in the service of the needy. Among the various works of the family apostolate, we might mention the following: adoption of abandoned children, welcome accorded to strangers, help in managing schools, advice and help for adolescents, help in preparation for marriage, support for married people and families in material and moral dangers, provision for the elderly, not only of necessities but also of an equitable share in economic development." What I want you to see here is how strikingly missionary that understanding of family is. And I say this because we live in a culture in which increasingly our social understanding of the family has been very much the opposite of this. Christopher Lasch, famous social commentator, wrote a book in the 1980s, I think it was, on the family, and the title is instructive: A Haven in a Heartless World, or Hostile World. I don't remember which is, but both get the same point. That we've tended to think of the family as an oasis, a haven, a safe place to pull back and protect our loved ones against all of the negative forces out there in the world. And yet that was not the council's vision of a Christian household. The council's vision of the Christian household is you get out there. You engage the world. You teach your children how to do that, right? Pope Francis has picked this up. And in his apostolic exhortation on marriage and family in Amoris Laetitia, he talks about the family as a social unit crucial for the transformation of the world. Now, why do I emphasize that? Because so often, when I talk about, the work of the church, we can get caught in, and I get caught in this a lot, complaints about what our pastor's doing or not doing, what our bishop's doing or not doing. But may I point out that this is our province. This is our province. I don't check with my pastor before thinking of my family as a domestic church. We are church. We're church because Father tells me we're church, or the Pope tells me. We are fundamentally a Christian community in our household, right? And as such, it is our obligation to engage the questions and challenges facing the world. And it is our obligation to form our children in that way, right? That is to say that I believe the household is a distinctive school in Christian virtue. What makes our household a church is not the number of statues we have or the number of times we say grace before meals. What makes our household a church is the extent to which we love as Jesus called us to love. We reconcile with one another. We forgive one another. We hold one another accountable, right? We emphasize the fundamental dignity of everyone in this household and our obligations to care for the least around us. And we do that as a household, as a family. Second priority that Pope Francis holds before us is the priority of listening. On the 50th anniversary of the creation of the Synod of Bishops, while the Synod on the Family was still going on, Pope Francis gave one of the most important speeches. In fact, I would argue it is the most important speech of his pontificate. Now, the occasion was that in 1965, Pope Paul VI had created the World Synod of Bishops. But what's striking in Pope Francis's speech is that he talked very little about the Synod of Bishops. Instead, what he spoke of and this is a term, by the way, that does not appear in the council documents in this form. He spoke of synodality. Synodality. And he plays with the etymological root of synodos, which means on a journey together. And he says, yes, it's a great gift that Pope Paul VI in 1965 created the World Synod of Bishops. But there's something more fundamental that the council was about. It wanted us to be synodal in character. That is to say, it wanted the whole church to become a listening church. That's a striking challenge. The very first words in the Dogmatic Constitution on Divine Revelation, Dei Verbum, the very first words say, hearing the Word of God in faith and proclaiming it in reverence, this sacred synod. It starts with the priority of listening. Now, I mention that to you because as Catholics, I would suggest to you we have become habituated to a church that starts with teaching first. Teaching one another, teaching non-Catholics, teaching the world. And yet the first move for the council was not teaching, it was listening. Right? In fact, one of the characteristic features of the council was the humility it had to recognize it needed to always first listen to the Spirit. Right? Before it did anything else, it needed to listen to the Spirit. And so in that very speech, Pope Francis says, indeed, for too long, we have been a hierarchically structured church in which we've imagined ourselves as a pyramid with the apex, at the top, right? Imagine flipping that pyramid over. He wants to say we've got to invert the pyramid. But we were accustomed to a notion with the Pope and then the bishops and then the lower clergy and then the laity at the very bottom. It was what I would call spiritual Reaganomics, right? Can't do that with my 18-year-old undergrads either. Supply side theory. You start at the top and you let it all trickle down. All truth and power starts at the top of the pyramid and maybe eventually a little of it gets to us. Francis says in that speech, we've got to invert the pyramid. The starting point is not the Pope and bishops and clergy, and then they hand on stuff to the laity. The starting point is the whole base, the whole baptized people of God, and the people who are supposed to be doing the listening are the ministers in the church. That's what he says, right? They do the listening. Right? Now, I'm going to expand that a little bit, but I think that's an important point here. At every level, he says, we have got to imagine a church that thinks of itself as called to humble listening. Right? He says, Jesus founded the church by setting at her head the apostolic college, in which the apostle Peter is the rock, the one who must confirm his brethren in the faith. But in this church, as in an inverted pyramid, the top is located at the base. Right? And then he introduces a theme that quite frankly received relatively little attention under his predecessors. Now, again, I want to be clear. I'm not interested in sort of putting white hats on some bishops and black popes and black hats on the others. I think every pope since the council has offered some gifts to the church. Pope John Paul II, Pope Paul VI, Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, each of them in their own way, it seems to me, have made important contributions. But they also neglected some things. I mean, in some ways, it's inevitable. There's 37,000 lines of text in the Vatican II documents. That's a lot of text. Almost everybody's going to focus on some things and not others. But what Pope Francis is focused on, one of the most important and yet frankly neglected teachings of the council, was what we sometimes refer to as the sensus fidei. Right? The sensus fidei. The sensus fidei refers to the supernatural instinct for the faith that according to Vatican II is given to every Christian. By baptism, we are given by God's grace an instinct, a capacity to listen. All of us are. To listen to God's word, according to Lumen Gentium 12, to hear God's word, to penetrate its meaning more profoundly, to apply it more comprehensively in our lives. Right? In another passage at the Second Vatican Council in Dei Verbum 8, it talks about how tradition grows and develops, not just because popes and bishops issue new decrees and encyclicals, Tradition grows and develops because of our spiritual experience, our contemplation and study. And so Pope Francis has time and again called forth this notion of the sensus fidei and says, if in fact all of us have a capacity to hear, to learn, to garner insight about our faith, then the church, all of us, needs to pay more attention to each other, right? In other words, this isn't just an individual capacity, this is a corporate capacity. All of us are called to be listeners of the Spirit, right? Now, what does that look like? I mean, what does that mean exactly? I mean, hasn't all of Revelation been given to us in Scripture and tradition and the doctrine of the church? Sure, in some sense. But I think we over-valorize the role of doctrine in some ways and under-valorize our own imaginations, our own experience, our own intuitions. When I was doing research for a book of mine in South Africa, I came across a remarkable mural on the side of a local church, a local parish. It was actually a mission station in a rural village in South Africa. And it was a mural, it became clear after a while for me that it was a mural of Christ the Good Shepherd. Right? But as I looked at the mural, I began to see some things that were kind of striking and unusual for me. And there were two things that stood out. One, Christ was dark-skinned, right? Which I wasn't used to seeing. Made all the sense in the world at that time, but at that moment in my life, that was like, wow, that's quite striking. Secondly, he was rather playful. He wasn't just at a distance looking at the sheep, he was actually interacting with the sheep, right? He was a young man, kind of just having some fun out in the fields. And of course, as that work of art worked on my imagination, I began to think differently about Jesus, right? My imagination begins to invite me to some new insight into who Jesus might be and what this very familiar image of Christ the Good Shepherd might mean changed for me in important ways, right? And so to the extent that I go back to my small faith community, when I return from South Africa, and I talk about this experience of seeing this mural and thinking about what it had to say to me about who Jesus was, to the extent that I share that with people in my community, and they go, wow, that is interesting. I'd never really thought of Jesus from that point of view. What are we doing? We're contributing to the faith of the church. There's something new that's kind of coming forth as we think about Jesus in a different way, right? Art has that capacity to do that to us, doesn't it? I mean, we never exhaust a great work of art. We always come back to it, and there's some new insight that comes to us. And the Council's teaching on the sense of faith is much like that. It says, when you and I reflect on our faith, particularly when we reflect together on our faith, when we reflect on our experience of following Jesus, we have new insight. And our faith and the faith of our community grows when we pay attention to that, right? And so Pope Francis has suggested that we need to think more about this listening church and what that looks like. And he calls for our church to develop some habits and structures. And here's the one time I haven't been focusing on sort of magisterium and clergy and so on, but I'll say a little bit about it because Pope Francis does. He says a synodal church, a church which listens, a church which realizes, I want to make sure here, okay? A church which realizes that listening is more than simply hearing, that it is a mutual listening in which everyone has something to learn. The faithful people, the College of Bishops, the Bishop of Rome, all listening to each other and all listening to the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth, in order to know what the Spirit says to the churches. And then he goes on and he says something very sage, very sage. He says, he's now talking about the role of the bishop, though I'm going to argue that what he has to say here applies to pastors, religious superiors, and chairs of university departments. In his mission of fostering a dynamic, open, and missionary communion, he'll have to encourage and develop the means of participation proposed in the Code of Canon Law and other forms of pastoral dialogue out of a desire to listen to everyone. This is the point. Out of a desire to listen to everyone and not simply to those who would tell him what he would like to hear. See, that's the key. See, I'll be honest with you, I've never met a bishop or a university president or a department chair who didn't think they were consultative. We're all consultative. The question is who we consult, right? That's the $64,000 question, and Pope Francis has put his finger on it. The tendency is for us to consult with people who think like us, who are going to tell us how obviously wise and mature and insightful and courageous our positions are. And he wants to say, that's not authentic listening, right? That's not authentic listening. Now, I focus there, as Pope Francis did, on the role of the bishop and pastors, but I want to argue that we can't just lay blame on the Pope or the bishops or our local pastor for not listening to us. I mean, it would be great if they would, and we should encourage all of our clergy to take to heart what Pope Francis just said. But I want to suggest that this challenge to become a listening church is a challenge that lays claim to all of us, right? That we need to spend more time cultivating intentional communities in which holy conversation is a customary practice of the church. I use that term, holy conversation, quite advisedly, because holy conversation, I believe, means having the courage to listen to people that you know will disagree with you. There's a theologian taught for many years at the University of Chicago named David Tracy. He has a very bracing definition of conversation. He says, conversation is a game with some hard rules. Say only what you mean. Say it as accurately as you can. Listen to and respect what the other says, however different or other. Be willing to correct or defend your opinions if challenged by the conversation partner. Be willing to argue if necessary, to confront if demanded, to endure conflict, to change your mind if the evidence suggests it. You see, holy conversation eschews what is most common in what passes for civic discourse in our country, which is the politics of demonization. In the politics of demonization, which are worked out every bit as much on Fox television as it is on MSNBC, the politics of demonization plays no partisan favorites. In the politics of demonization, I always assume the worst of my opponents. I always impute the worst intentions, the worst interpretation of what they mean. I never assume their goodwill, right? And I view every conflict as a battle to be won, not a dialogue to be engaged. And yet, if we're to be the listening church, we're to invert the pyramid where all of us are called to be listeners, we have to have the courage to create communities and spaces and opportunities where we listen to people who we know will have different views than ours. And we have to follow the rules, which does call for us to speak out of our own convictions, but to have the humility to hear the other and to be open to the possibility of change. All of which leads me to the third and final priority. For Pope Francis, the third priority that has implications for all of us is what I'm calling the priority of encounter. Pope Francis has spoken time and again of the culture of encounter, which for him means having the courage to deal with people who are different intellectually and philosophically and ideologically, but in particular, he wants to say culturally. He's very concerned that in a global world, there's a kind of homogenization that takes place, a flattening out that denies the distinctive contributions, particularly of the poor and the marginalized, indigenous cultures. And he wants to make sure that we attend to all of those as having something to teach us. And so he spoke in Evangelii Gaudium of the need for us to move from the image of the sphere, which is defined by the fact that every point on the sphere is equidistant from the center. Every point on the sphere is equidistant from the center. and instead to embrace the polyhedron, which is constituted by a wide range of differing sides and angles, right? That each have their own particularity. And he believes that it's important in our society and in the church that we have the courage to engage people's differences, their distinctive experiences and perspectives, and to be open to what God might be saying to us from those experiences and perspectives. And so he writes, here our model is not the sphere which is no greater than its parts, where every point is equidistant from the center. There are no differences between them. Instead, it is the polyhedron, which reflects the convergence of all its parts, each of which preserves its distinctiveness. Pastoral and political activity alike, note that, pastoral and political activity alike, seek to gather in this polyhedron the best of each, for there is a place for the poor and their culture, their aspirations and their potential. And even people who can be considered dubious on account of their errors have something to offer, which must not be overlooked. It is the convergence of peoples who within the universal order maintain their own individuality. It is the sum total of persons within a society which pursues the common good, which truly has a place for everyone, right? What is he inviting us to here? And I think this is, again, something that is incumbent upon us as the laity in particular. And that is to recognize how often and at how many points in our life we encounter people whose difference can be unsettling to us. And we can engage that difference in a lot of different ways. We can engage it simply by denunciation, by relying on stereotypes, right? We can also avoid that discomfort through a kind of passive, lowest common denominator, each his own kind of mentality that also doesn't take other people's difference seriously, right? And I don't think Pope Francis wants either of those things. I think he wants us to struggle to really engage people and listen to them and grapple with their own particular experience. Not necessarily to acquiesce to it, right? But to be open to the possibility that in their otherness, and including the otherness that is threatening, there might be something that we have to learn. Now, I say this is incumbent upon us as the laity, not because I think it's not also an obligation of the clergy, but I think there's a way in which the laity, through our immersion in the world in our daily lives, encounter this otherness on a daily basis much more. And so the obligation falls often on us to say, here's what I've learned as I've gotten to know my Muslim neighbor. Here's what I've learned when I've tried to understand my son who came out as gay, about what it means for him to be gay. Not when I put a category on him or a term on him, but simply to hear him talk about his experience of his sexuality. Here's what I've learned about that. Right? To have a polyhedraic understanding of church and world is to believe that God can teach us something in our encounter with people who are different across a wide register of categories. So what I've tried to do in the time I've had here, and I've taken a little bit more time than I intended, was to draw on the teaching of the council and 3 priorities and attendant images that Pope Francis offers us as an invitation for us to think not about the reforms that needs to happen among the bishops and the clergy and in seminaries. Those things have to happen. We can talk about them in a little bit. But to think a little bit more about what Pope Francis is calling each of us to as we consider our own participation in the mission of the church. And the images that he's given us. The image of the church is a field hospital where we go to people to meet their needs out of our own vulnerability in solidarity with them. Our commitment not to just wag our fingers and teach, but to listen. And our commitment to engage people's otherness in an attitude of humility is a challenge that I think lies before all of us if we are going to do the kind of missionary work that Pope Francis invites us to. Thank you.
So let's just take a couple minutes of quiet and absorb all that we've heard in the last hour, and then we'll take some time for some questions and answers. So just take a minute of quiet. We don't do that often enough. So who might have a question?
Can you talk just a second about seminarian formation these days?
Well, I tried my best not to go there, but well, first I'll recommend a document that in Truth in Advertising, I was part of a 2-year seminar at Boston College focused on this question and published a document that appeared in Origins in December called To Serve the People of God, which focuses on this question. And obviously what I tried to focus on in my presentation today was a kind of a broader challenge to all of us about how we must take responsibility for the ongoing reform and renewal of our church. But, you know, I don't think there's any way around it. When we look at the clerical sexual abuse crisis that we've dealt with in the church today, I think too often we've been inclined to focus on the symptom rather than the cause. And so there's a lot of emphasis, for example, on kind of policing, on accountability and transparency and, removing statutes of limitations and so on. And I think all those things have to happen, oversight boards and so on. But I don't know that they get to the heart of the problem. And I think the heart of the problem, and here I'm with Pope Francis on this. Pope Benedict has a very different analysis of what's going on today. I tend to be more inclined to Pope Francis's analysis, in which he focuses on a deeply entrenched clerical culture. And I think to some extent that starts in seminary. I think there's a lot of reason to wonder whether the way we form seminarians for the priesthood makes a lot of sense right now. It's a quasi-monastic environment that emphasizes separation in a lot of ways. It's governed by a spiritual and liturgical discipline that's appropriate to monastic life. I'm not sure it's appropriate for priests who are going to spend the rest of their lives not living in that kind of secluded, highly structured environment. But most problematically, it's a form of formation that I'm not sure immerses them in the life and concerns and spirituality of the people that they're going to serve for the rest of their lives. And that's my bigger concern. There was a movement about 10, 15, 20 years ago after a series of apostolic visitations on seminaries to really ramp up the separation of seminary life from the life of ordinary lay folks. So there was a discouragement about seminarians studying with lay people. There was some concerns about women, for example, not serving as spiritual directors for seminarians. And, my own inclination is we need to go in the opposite direction. I'm actually inclined to believe the Archdiocese of Paris undertook an experiment about 3 or 4 years ago in which they dramatically limited the amount of time that seminarians lived in a secluded seminary, and instead had them do the vast majority of their seminary formation living in smaller communities attached to parishes, where they were surrounded by parishioners and support groups that helped remind them of their fundamental questions and concerns. I tend to believe, this is a little too pithy by half, but one of the most, problematic features of the pastoral life of the Catholic Church is that we have become habituated to giving really eloquent answers to questions no one's asking. And the only way to get around that is for the people who are doing that to spend a little more time listening to the real questions of people's lives. Presbyterorum Ordinis Article 4, when it's talking about the ministry of preaching, says that in the ministry of preaching, the priest has a special obligation to attend to the often complex features of the daily lives of the people they serve. And you don't get that by reading a book. You've got to be in a situation where you're formed to be a listener, an attentive listener to the insights and concerns of those people. So we have to do a better job, I think, of that. The second thing I would say is, oh, there's a bishop in the room, and, I may never get invited back here or whatever, but I taught for 10 years in the seminary, and it was a wonderful experience for me. So I don't want to bash seminary formation. But there is a general tendency in which seminary formation has become more about discerning impediments to ordination. Is there a serious obstacle to our ordaining this person? Than discerning a charism of pastoral leadership. And I think we need to spend a lot more time thinking about the whole vocational process, from interview all the way through, more not in terms of how do we weed out problems, but how do we discern who really has the gift of pastoral leadership? And what that should start with is, do we see in them an ability and an eagerness to identify and celebrate the gifts of others, right? And I don't know that we spend enough time thinking about that. We're never going to go back to the period of the 1950s when we had a surplus of priests. But we don't need as many if we have priests who have the gift of recognizing the gifts of other people and calling forth those gifts and empowering those gifts. So our seminary formation, our whole vocational process, I think has to pay a lot more attention to that aspect than we have in the past. Right? I'll leave it at that. And okay. Yes. Or whoever's got the mics. I don't have the mic, so.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gilardi. That was very enlightening. You talked about accessing the sensus fidei and moving toward more consultative habits and structures. And while I agree with that, I think one problem is that it still leaves the authority in the hands of clergy. And I was wondering if you see a role for more authoritative role or decision-making power in the laity, and what might be the theological backings of that.
Sure. So let's have a little back and forth on that. So why do you think it's still, why do you think that it still leaves the role of authority in the clergy?
Excuse me, the implication of consultation.
Right.
You have the authority, the official voice of the church.
Okay. All right, good. So this is what I want to get at. Note the presupposition here, and I'm not trying to pick on you at all. This is something, actually, if I go back and I look at my own writing, I think I've been very critical of this. Here's the tendency in fundamental theology and ecclesiology. We tend to think of the sensus fidei as identifying crypto doctrine. That is, we assume that the point of the sense of the faith is ultimately to emerge in the form of doctrinal teaching, which, of course, we believe is, in a particular way, the province of the bishops. Now, let me be very clear. I do think it's the province of the bishops. I think the bishops have a distinctive responsibility to safeguard the doctrinal teaching of the church. I'm not disputing that. But the truth of the matter is, most of our faith is not governed by formal doctrinal pronouncements. The faith that shapes our lives oftentimes doesn't emerge in some formal doctrinal presentation at all. It's often a much more intuitive faith. It's an embodied faith. It's a faith that manifests itself not in some new doctrinal insight that I hope our bishops will take into account, but finds its way in popular religious practice, that finds its way in the culture of the home that we develop, in the way we shape the values and virtues that we want our children to participate in. In other words, I think it's a mistake to imagine that the point of the sensus fidei is always moving towards formal doctrinal pronouncements, which is the role of the bishops. I want to say, in fact, that the lived Christian faith rarely is about formal doctrinal pronouncements. And in fact, to be perfectly blunt, and that recent, okay, now I'm on a roll now. I'm ready to rant. Everybody's seen that recent poll on how few Catholics believe in real presence and so on. I mean, it just drives me nuts, right? But it drives me nuts because it's evaluating the authentic and orthodox faith of the church with some kind of terminological rigor, right? Which is just silliness. I mean, my maternal grandmother knew more about the Eucharist than I would ever know, but she couldn't have explained transubstantiation to me if her life depended on it. And if she did, it would have been a heterodox explanation. It would have been physicalist. That was the world she worked at, but I don't think she didn't believe in the Eucharist, right? I don't think she had this technological rigor to articulate it in the formal propositional language to which we theologians are accustomed. So I want us to kind of dishabituate ourselves from the idea that the point of the sensus fidei is all to move towards formal doctrinal pronouncements. Much of the faith of the church lived in the Christian community before there was ever a doctrinal pronouncement about it. I mean, if you go back in time and ask St. Augustine to explain transubstantiation, you're going to get a blank look. The term hadn't been invented yet, right? So I do, by the way, I'm not dodging, I am dodging a little bit. There's still a question about the role that the laity, the whole people of God and theologians play in the development of doctrine and calling forth possible doctrinal change. I want to grant that. But I don't want to grant so much of it that we forget how much of that faith is a lived faith that has its own power and integrity, not just in terms of whether it leads to some new doctrinal pronouncement. Does that make sense? Yes. All right, thank you.
Yes, I'm right here in front of you. Right here.
God? Oh, there we go. Okay. Not God. Sorry. Go on.
It's a compliment. So I'm of the opinion that clericalism often begins in the pews, where the lay people put priests and clergy up on a pedestal. And I'm speaking as a lay ecclesial minister.
Yeah.
You know, who I don't have the title, I don't have the collar, but I have the degree, I have the experience.
Right.
How do we, so we're not talking about seminaries, we're talking about the lay people.
Right.
How do we undo that genesis of clericalism?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's the genesis of it. I think we're complicit in it, but I don't think we're the source of it. Okay, I do think there are structural features that through theology, through church law, through all sorts of customs and practices have created a situation where we believe strictly by belonging to a certain class within the church, there is a certain kind of power and preference and privilege that's accrued to them. Now, we are often complicit in it, and we maintain it in many ways. I don't think we're the source of it, all right? But I do think we can be part of the solution, part of the undoing, which is to say I do think we can learn to treat the ordained ministers in our community with the respect that we would anybody who has a particular authority and competence and recognize that and a particular ministerial calling. But we can do that without contributing to the unthinking deference that is, in fact, the default approach of many lay people in the church, who would simply never think, for example, of inviting their pastor to formally create a community that would offer them constructive feedback regarding their preaching on a regular basis. Now, that's not priest bashing, but that's also not being complicit in the standing in the back of the church and fawning over Father. Oh, Father, that was such a wonderful homily. I mean, and they may have been that, but I mean, there are ways in which we can fight the kind of the problem of clericalism without bashing priests, but simply cutting into that unthinking privilege that we often play into, the deference that we give them, and instead to recognize that they should be accountable in the same way that you as a lay ecclesial minister, I assume you believe you should be accountable to the people you serve. So there are ways in which we can invite the ordained and other lay ecclesial ministers into relationships of genuinating that clerical culture. I just don't agree with you that we're the source of it.
You gave a rich texture to a period of time that, if I recall, at least attributed to St. John the 23rd, was to open the windows and let the Holy Spirit in. My fear is that those windows have been closed. And the vitality and the richness of your description of the depth and breadth of lay priority in Vatican II, I am afraid in my own experience has been lost.
Yeah.
And Vatican II has become more a moment in history rather than a transformational moment in our faith. How do we restore the transformational nature of Vatican II so it becomes transformational and not just an historic reference in a religion class?
Sure, thank you. Well, your question's very good. It suggests I failed in some important way here. Because, no, I mean that quite seriously. I'm not being facetious. I mean, what I was trying to do was precisely that. In other words, I mean, I certainly share a certain despondency with the way in which some of the vitality of the Council's vision has been domesticated, marginalized, kind of given a formal nod to, but then really ignored, right? I get that. But I also think there's an important part of the Council's vision that it is entirely in our power to appropriate. It is entirely in my power to think about my family as a household called to live out the missionary call that Pope Francis is inviting us to. It is entirely within my power to start intentional communities that are communities about dialogue and conversation, in which I would invite our clergy, our pastor to participate, but I don't have to wait for a father to do that for me to create an intentional faith community that wants to talk in a very real way about what the Sunday liturgical readings are saying to us as followers of Jesus. I was trying to, in other words, to highlight elements of the Council's and Pope Francis's vision that I think it's very much in our power to appropriate and realize in ecclesial contexts. Now, I also want to engage our bishops and our pastors and our parish life so that those things are also part there. And I think in an ideal world, they'll also be part of the vitality of parish life. But even in situations, clearly nowhere in the Archdiocese of Atlanta, but in other parts of the world where there are parishes that aren't vital, I want to say there are things that we can do as lay people to revitalize the Council's mission in our own experience of Christian life. And I think we've got to pay more attention to those things, right? So from my point of view, the two things I would put forward again, an emphasis on how we think about the family as a Christian household called to be a school of virtue and a school of mission. And secondly, how it is within our control to create intentional communities. What I've heard about, what's the name of the inter-parish? CLIP. Is a creative example of coming up with, oftentimes I suspect, lay-initiated spaces for dialogue across multiple parishes and various communities. They're not, I'm going to guess, I assume, they're not anti-clerical, they're not anti-priest or anything. They're simply, oftentimes, I'm going to guess, lay-driven initiatives to create spaces where more vital conversation can happen. Again, that's something that's in our power to do. And that was my point today, was to focus on those things that we, in fact, can take on for ourselves.
You said earlier that the sensus fidei is a gift of baptism, which of course includes our separated brethren. So
Yes, it does.
How does that fact impact our ecumenical conversations? And are we doing a good job of that in your estimation?
Good question. We are doing that better in our formal dialogues than in our informal Christian interactions. I actually think we do a quite good job in our formal dialogues. Is Professor Scheib still here? Is Karen still here, or did she leave? All right. One of the professors on the faculty here spent 5 years with me on the Catholic Methodist Ecumenical Dialogue. It was a great privilege of my life, and I think of hers as well. And one of the things that is so striking about the formal ecumenical dialogues is the way in which we practice what's sometimes called receptive ecumenism, which is to say that we enter into dialogue saying in all humility, not first what we have that we're right on and you're wrong, but what can we learn from you? What can we learn from you? Now, that doesn't mean that we completely pass the differences between us, but we think about that dialogue in terms of a kind of careful listening that allows us to learn from the other and correct misunderstandings that we had. So the most momentous event in formal ecumenical dialogue was the 1999 Joint Declaration on Justification by Faith between the Roman Catholic Church and the Lutheran World Federation. What allowed us to come to that joint declaration was both Catholics and Lutherans in humility saying, okay, tell me again what you mean by justification. Tell me again what you mean by concupiscence. Tell me again what you mean by faith. And then through that careful, disciplined, hard work of listening to what's said and not said, beginning to recognize, oh, I thought you meant this when you used that term, but in fact, you meant this. Does that follow? And it allowed us to get to a point where while we didn't completely agree on everything, we achieved what we call differentiated consensus. That is a fundamental agreement, even though we might put a different accent, one side or the other, on some aspect of that issue. But that only comes about through synodality, through that disciplined listening to the other, while at the same time articulating your own convictions. Now, I think we've learned to do that quite well in our formal ecumenical dialogues, or reasonably well. I don't know that we're as intentional about that in our ordinary Christian life. I actually fear that we've lost some of the vitality of ecumenism at the local level. That is to say, we have a kind of low-level religious tolerance. Well, oh, you know, you guys believe what you want, we'll believe what we want. But I don't know that there's the same curiosity that there once was to talk to a member of another Christian tradition or another world religious tradition and engage in that kind of careful listening. So talk to me again about why you do this, why you believe that, right? That kind of discipline, what I called holy conversation, is a habit that we need to encourage much more in our local churches when it comes to ecumenical conversation.
I hear a lot of references to canon law, and canon law...
Tonight?
No, not tonight. Not tonight.
Okay.
In my life or my
Okay,
work.
sure.
And then how it always seems to be written in stone, and it seems to me to be tied a lot to clericalism.
Right.
And I'm kind of curious about how canon law gets changed and whether there's ever been any laity involved in writing canon law.
Oh, that's a great question. Well, so it gets changed in a lot of different ways. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is the first time the Roman Catholic Church had a universal code of canon law was 1917. Prior to that, we had canon law, but there was not one collection of canon law that was binding for the whole church until the early 20th century. And then, of course, one of the things that Pope John the 23rd called for on January 25th, 1959, when at the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, he announced Vatican II. He also announced, nobody pays attention to this, the need to reform the Code of Canon Law, because he realized it was outdated in a lot of ways. Well, of course, what ended up happening is once Vatican II started going on, it made no sense to reform canon law until we'd kind of dealt with the fundamental issues the council would deal with. After the council ended, Pope Paul VI picked that up again, says, okay, now the council's ended, we need to reform the Code of Canon Law. And I believe, a seriously flawed process for doing that, and I could say more about that, but I don't want to put everybody else asleep, took place, and it finally led to the 1983-1984 revised Code of Canon Law. Canon law is not doctrine. I mean, it's one of the most important things for understanding. Sometimes it codifies elements of doctrine. It's not doctrine, it's discipline. Any community of any size needs a set of rules and disciplines to govern how we're going to be with one another. So canon law puts the faith of the church in concrete action through a set of disciplinary decrees and laws and rules that just allow us to get along together in the same way that any large society has to do that, right? Technically, it is revised largely by way of the Pope. He's the one who can on his own do that, but he can also create a commission that could bring about changes in the Code of Canon Law. There's nothing in principle that would prevent lay people from being part of that. So if Pope Francis tomorrow were to say, you know, I think we actually need a fundamental revision of the Code of Canon Law like the one that we did before, but maybe even more comprehensive, and I would be on board right away. I think that's actually a huge need in our church. There is nothing that would prevent us from having the commission that worked on the reform of canon law populated by all lay canon lawyers. And there are, by the way, a number of lay canonists out there today. So there's nothing that would preclude that other than a lack of vision and a lack of confidence in lay people. But I certainly would agree with you that there's much about the Code of Canon Law that does need to be revised. In fact, in some ways, I think the problem was it happened too soon after Vatican II. It happened before we had, as a church, enough time to let the deeper vision of the council seep in. So in the Code of Canon Law, even though it quotes large passages of Vatican II, it in fact misses some really important insights from the council. there's almost none of the pneumatology, the theology of the Holy Spirit of Vatican II found in the Code of Canon Law. There's almost no mention of the notion of charism, which is such an important category in Vatican II. So there was a way in which the reform of the canon law just happened too quickly after Vatican II. We didn't have enough time to let the council's vision sink in. And so now I think, really, I do think the time is ripe. Even more, people ask me, should we have a new ecumenical council? In some ways, I'd rather see us start all over with a new Code of Canon Law before we tried to think about having a new council. Thank you. That was a good question.
I have a very practical, basic question. It seems to me, and through my own
Can you talk a
experience-
little bit more into that, Mike?
Here?
No, it's on. You just got to, believe it or not, you got to put
Really,
it right up
into
there.
it. Okay. A concern that, and you described this pyramid with this large base, but as I see it, even in my family and among friends, and people are walking away from the church since this last scandal. Has
Yes.
really been the impetus to push people away.
Yeah.
And what can we do as a parish, or what kind of mechanism, or how do you see? I mean, we can't necessarily reach our children or our grandchildren. Is there something the parish could do, or this community you're talking, or the priest can do to stem this tide?
Well, I hope so, but I don't think the solution is very easy. And part of that is, I think the problems that have led to this kind of massive disaffiliation are much broader than just what's going on in the Catholic Church. First of all, almost all the demographic studies tell us this is a problem for almost all mainline religion, all right? It's not just a problem of Catholicism. Now, I'm not minimizing the particular characteristics of what's going on in the Catholic Church. I think that there are broader mechanisms. So let me paint very impressionistically some of those larger problems. First of all, we live in a contemporary world and a point in time where there is a rampant anti-institutionalism in Western culture in general. And when I say anti-institutionalism, I mean anti-institutions of any kind. There's his name is, there's a sociologist from George Mason University, and I can't think of his name, but he wrote a book called Thinking Institutionally. And he documents over about 12 pages all of the institutional scandals in the United States alone from the time of the Vietnam War up to the present. I mean, and it's striking in every area: higher education, professional sports, the Boy Scouts, finance, the military, campaign financing, right? I mean, everything. And so what we see here is almost an unprecedented suspicion of institutions of any kind, right? So that's a big problem right there, right? Secondly, there is a kind of an allergy, and it's an understandable one, but a kind of allergy to the very notion of normative faith claims. So there's a Canadian sociologist named David Lyon who wrote a wonderful book titled Jesus in Disneyland, another title I love, in which he says that what we're experiencing in the Western world is not a lack of interest in religion, but what he calls the deregulation of religion, which is to say people are very interested in religious experience and spirituality. What they don't want is somebody telling them what their experience or practice is supposed to be like, right? They don't want it regulated. And so to the extent that any religious tradition offers some kind of normative claims, this is what we're about, this is what we do, there's a kind of allergic resistance to that kind of thing, right? Now, there's a particular problem of that in the Catholic Church, it seems to me. So there was a hyper-dogmatism, almost a fundamentalist hyper-dogmatism that's emerged as a backlash to Vatican II in the last couple of decades. And, you know, I think that's become a real problem. There's been an alignment of, I could go on and on and on. So I do think we're up against some pretty significant headwinds, culturally speaking, right? The other thing is, in a way, Vatican II's success became part of the problem. And by that, I'm not blaming Vatican II at all. But, you know, there was a sense in which part of the Catholic ethos before Vatican II had a certain amount of fear. The fear of you were in peril of your salvation if you weren't part of the church, right? Well, Vatican II comes along and it offers what we might call a salvific optimism. a much greater openness to the possibility that salvation could be afforded to people outside the Catholic Church, even outside religious practice and belief, right? Now, I don't object to that, but what happened then was that one of the fundamental principles justifying or encouraging religious belonging, fear of our damnation, was taken away. And in the place of that, we failed to develop an alternative rationale for why being part of this faith community matters, right? So what we need is another rationale, another articulation, another story of why belonging to a community of faith, any community of faith, makes a difference. Now, I'm interested in doing that. I think we can do that, but I think we need a whole different vocabulary for talking about why communal belonging matters. And until we can explain that, and I'm thinking of this, I'm talking to you not just as a theologian, all right? I got boys 28, 28, 25, and 23. I got about 2.35 of them are practicing the faith. 2 of them regularly, 1 every now and then, and the other he's not sure at all, right? So I'm trying to make this argument as a parent as much as I am as a theologian to my kids. Why does belonging to a community of faith matter? We've got to think a lot more about that than, this is what the church teaches. If you don't do this, you're going to hell. I mean, we need a much better account of that than most of us have, right? And it's out there, but I think we haven't done as much work on that as we should.
So we have time for one more question. Over here.
So not to keep going on with the same point, but Andy mentioned earlier about laity and our view of clergy, and I heard or I listened to your response, but I'm troubled because I consider myself one of the involved lay leaders in my parish. I consider my pastor to be somebody who listens, somebody who is very sympathetic to everything we talk about. Yet, divide is there, and
Yes.
it's not, and a lot of that originates in me or in our own within our parish and among parishioners. And at recent meeting, everybody by and large deferred to our pastor for his opinion and considered him, in words of few, a CEO. And it struck me because, you keep talking about a priest as a servant, and by and large, I know a lot of us don't look at it that way. We see him as a, man in charge, not even a counselor. Mm-hmm. And so I don't, as Andy was asking, I really, as a woman in church, I'm discouraged.
Sure.
And so I don't really know, because I think, I'm in this great parish, and yet I feel like I'm, hitting my head against the wall. So what would, as a practical advice, what would you say to me? So I leave on some optimistic note.
Oh, my. No, I say that because, first of all, I mean, there's a lot of ways in which I'm reluctant to offer anything. First, I'm not a woman in the church. And the experience of discouragement that many women have, that my wife has, I feel like I do my best to understand. And in many ways, I do feel it deeply. But I don't want to pretend that I feel it the way you do or the way my wife does. So I want to, first of all, I suppose I want to say I'm cautious about responding, because it's not as if I can say, oh, yeah, I know exactly how you feel and what that's like. I don't, right? I've tried to learn and hear that. I agree on many, formal levels about things that need to change in the church, but I just don't want to claim that I can tap into the experience quite as you have it. I think each of us has to negotiate the painful reality of continuing to belong to a community of faith in our own way. And I think for all of us at some level, continuing to belong to a community of faith will call forth pain and suffering and sometimes betrayal. I don't want to diminish it. I don't want to suggest it's distributed evenly. It's not distributed evenly. I think we need a community, though, to walk with us in our pain. But at some point, we have to make a decision whether continued belonging to this community and all of its brokenness and its dysfunction bears enough reward, enough value, enough promise for the possibility of growth in Christian faith and love to allow us to continue without being complacent. And for those who have gotten to a threshold where they've said, I just can't, it's too toxic, it's too dysfunctional, it's too harmful, I would never say, well, you've made the wrong decision. I think that's a calculus that none of us can make alone. But my hope and my vocation is to work as hard as I can to create the conditions where even those who feel they're treated unfairly in the church can feel like they have a voice to speak that pain, that hurt, that lament, and can find enough grace in the community to continue to justify that ecclesial belonging. But I don't know that I have any silver bullet that I can offer you on that. All right?
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
Gilardi.